multiple options, minimally 2, potentially 3. So how do we translate sholti? Because this can be translated into English into lose. So kids can be loose. At the same time, kids can be dissolved. This is a plausible translation. Is a really creepy one, but is plausible considering the meaning of the Italian word. And even considering the meaning of the English translation, lose, it can even imply that these kids have really low moral standards. Now, we can discard this because they're kids, but these are all plausible options. And they're all linked to this polysemous nature of the Italian word sciolti, which triggers multiple potential meanings. And the why doesn't work? Oh, sorry. What is going on? Okay, so it has multiple potential meanings, I was saying, but so if we go a step back, so really like physically going a step back and picking the broader context where this picture has been taken, the meanings of the words are somewhat becomes constrained by the specific context of occurrence. We can immediately discard that the dissolved reading of Sholti, does not apply. It also becomes clear that this is a board on the street. It is in Italy, and I mean, you can infer this from the architecture of the building. If you're like an Italian person, you can even say that this is in the specific region of Italy, given to the architecture. But this is a street. So basically, the most important message to take away is that this board is on a street where cars also go. Now, it calls to pay attention for kids who can just be outside playing. So, and a good translation of, I think, a good translation in English could be something like "attention, kids at play." And the point that I want to make with this example is that I've been doing this for this job for some time. Sorry, not this presentation, but this job for some time, and I started by being a really big fan of Chomskyan grammar and Chomskyan approach, but I've become more and more convinced that when we comes and also oriented to interpret meaning as primarily contextual. So here I'm just quoting a sentence from a book by Brigitte Bazzallo, 2023. Words acquire their dimensions of meaning contextually. And yes, words are basically sounds. They're in Latin, we can say they're just flatus voci. And they really acquire all their dimensions of meaning when they're put in their proper context. The problem, if you want, this is really like an issue. If we start looking at what context means, well, we find that this is a really pretty complicated notion, which is composed by multiple layers or dimensions. And they involve multiple aspects. So is the situation, and even if when it comes to the written part, the situation in which something is actually written down matters as the context in order to better interpret the meaning of what is written down, the speaker and the receiver, and most importantly also their social roles. Who is speaking? What is the social role of someone saying something at a specific moment in time? The assumed packs of use of a word. It's true that meaning is arbitrary, and we decide that okay, a specific word has a specific meaning, but there are also words that have potentially connotations that have additional, they bear additional meaning on top of their literal meanings, and there is a shared assumption that okay, I can use this word in this context because I'm allowed to do this, and this is part of my packs of use of this word. And in other contexts, you're not allowed to use exactly the same word. Okay, not making examples, but you can imagine to what I'm kind of referring. I mean, a good example here, it could be like reappropriation terms. Reappropriation terms is just really like they are defined by these packs of use that allows you to actually use some of these terms in specific contexts and not in others. And the last dimension also involves the tone and the intention. So, I mean, as a word can be said with a really mean tone and a really bad intention. So it can just be playfully neutral, but the way you use it can become harmful. So if I want you to reflect with me for a moment. So what happens right now in kind of natural language processing? So everything that we do is really inspired by distributional semantic hypothesis. And so everybody knows this quote from Philip, you should know the meaning of a word by the company it keeps. Yes, this is what we are doing. We are adopting this pragmatically oriented theory of meaning, but we are missing many dimensions of meaning, many dimensions of what is the context. Because if you adopt this theory of meaning, then you need also to account for the context of occurrence of a word, and we are missing a lot. There have been attempts to introduce some of the dimensions of context that I was discussing before, like hateful symbols or hateful people. That's a paper. I think that's exact title. The demographic factor improved classification paper. There has been lots of work by Deep Covey in this direction, and then more recently there are works that adopt this perspective paradigm, which is promoted by Valerio Basile at the University of Turin. So there are attempts into introducing more and more, so making the context more multidimensional. But the point that I really want to make now is that, okay, if we consider that there are some social factors that are important in the way that we use language, then we also need to change a bit perspective on some of the key linguistic notions and linguistic devices, the way we have studied so far, or the way we have maybe interpreted them so far. For instance, maybe grammar is not just a series of, or if you want the syntax, it's not just a series of arbitrary set of rules that allow the combination of lexical items in a meaningful, and yes, unintended grammatically corrected way. But maybe it's something more. And here I'm quoting Mark Halliday. So grammar is actually a theory of the human experience. So what we decide to use as a subject and what we allow to stay in subject position, it's really reflecting our perception of the word, our perception of the word as a community of speakers, not just me, my personal perception of the word. And if grammar is an instance of not just grammar here, you need to think in terms of instances of specific natural languages. And it's not just the deep syntax, if you want. But if grammar is a theory of the human experience, then the categories and the concept of our experience are actually construed by language. So basically, this is why language construes reality. And this construction, so the fact that our experience are construed by language, and they are construed at the intersection of the material with the symbolic components. Now, to elaborate a bit on this line of argumentation, we can just go slightly a step further. And here I'm quoting Fairclough. So we're moving towards critical discourse analysis as a reference framework. And what Fairclough made clear is that social structure determines property of the discourse, and discourse in terms determines social structures. So this means that the way we interact, our interactions, are dependent on subsuming that there are some sort of neutralized ideologies. There is what we can also call, in a more neutral way, common sense, shared background, and for instance, just to make an example, a quick example. So stereotypes are an example of such an instance of such naturalized ideologies. Even positive stereotypes is just a way of, okay, so I am taking into consideration a sort of, I'm assuming that something is valid and apply this to everybody that I'm referring to. We do this every single time that we interact in our with everybody else, consciously, sometimes, most of the times unconsciously. So we always use these we always read and speak of using these naturalized ideologies. And I mean, these ideologies, or if you want perspectives, we can use also more neutral perspectives. They can be expressed a really different layer when it comes to language. The easiest, the most easy to see is lexicon. The way you choose a specific word, the way you decide to refer to something already tells a lot in terms of how you cut what's your perspective of the word. At a more subtle and a more difficult also level of analysis, you can look at this perspective as they are realized in syntax. Okay, so today my talk will really try to move between lexicon and syntax, taking perspective into account and showing how these things are actually happening in a specific domain of sustainability or environmental sustainability. Okay, so I want to start by exactly speaking of the first part of how we activate these ideologies or perspective. And I want to focus on the lexicon. Why the lexicon? Because, as I said before, it's the most transparent way. And if in a way, by elaborating with respect to what I said at the really beginning, so language constructs reality primarily by creating new words. Okay, that's how we make sense of the word. And creating new words means creating neologism, and a neologism actually answer a specific need in a community of speakers. If you have the need to create a new word because you need to refer to something that is happening in the world, and the way you create this word is actually a doorway to see how people are actually conceptualizing society or the world. Okay, so the fact that there is a name to refer to a phenomenon or an event makes it much easier to grasp, and it brings together basically all the features that constitute and facilitate these creations of a new concept. Okay, and once a word is available to name or to refer to something, then it's easier to discuss it. It's easy to even become aware of a specific problem. Okay, now the way the neologism is created can encode a perspective. Definitely. It's not always, but it can encode a perspective. And the way you actually encode this perspective is can open discussions in society about the specific phenomenon. And if you're lucky enough, you can actually even trigger a social change. It can be positive, hopefully, most of the time. Sometimes it can also be negative. It depends on how society moves. Okay. To make an example of these circle that you see, new word, awareness, debate, potential social change. I hope that, I mean, potentially you are aware of the neologism flight shame, which, right? Oh, what does it does? Oh, it's a new word that actually is able to grasp a feeling of people being uncomfortable in using an aeroplane to travel. Okay. And what was interesting is that by making this word available, there has been a study, it was early 2020, that has shown that in Germany, the social norms, so the way society was actually behaving related to using flight, so related to flying, tends to shifty. I mean, in the direction of let's try to use less flight. When in the month they were following the diffusion of the debate and the presence of this word, so flight shame was actually helping to discuss about the problem and also making people more aware and shifting some change in society. Okay, now this is the general way in which the presence of a new word can actually encode an ideology, a perspective, and have an impact on the society. How do we create new words? We can identify basically three broad ways in doing this. The first is through framing. Framing here refers to Fillmorian frames, so interpretative frames. I'm really quoting. So what does a frame means here is the particular organization of knowledge which stands as a prerequisite to understand the meaning of the associated word. Classic example, so that everybody is actually on page, because this could be a mouthful. Think about the words mother, brother, and daughter. If you start thinking about their meanings cannot be actually fully understood without at least the concept of family relationships. This is a way in which framing actually really works. I mean, in the domain of ecology or sustainability, an interesting neologism that is based on framing is the one that you see on the slides, is carbon indulgence. That's a neologism that is based on framing. Sustainable development is another neologism which is based on using the notion of framing. Other ways that that are available to create new words or to create neologism. One is the metaphor, which happily, I mean, is a tool that helps us to reach two concepts. Nice example is carbon footprint. So you make concrete something that is a bit abstract and tangible, so the carbon emissions. And then there is anchoring. And anchoring is an approach by when you create a new word or a new concept by linking something that is new and unknown to existing one. So for instance, the notion of greenwashing has been generated using the original whitewashing notion. Okay, today I want to focus just on neologism created by anchoring. And these neologisms are, and in particular, I want to focus on those neologisms that are responsible for what? Reframing, actually renegotiating something, which is the grammar as we see it in the holiday definition, so our experience of reality in a way, of food. So I want you to walk you through like a renegotiation that is actually ongoing in English, but also in other languages, pretty sure, at least in the global north, of the way we speak about food. I want to start with these four words: milk, burger, cheese, and meat. I mean, everybody is more or less consuming these. And a basic search really is like, if you take this word and put it into a search engine, or take the word and just put it into an LLM, whatever. So with no much additional information, this is what you will get back. Some of these images are actually generated by an LLM, and some are actually coming back from a Google search. So you just type cheese and then you go on images, boom, what do I see if I see something like that? If you look at these images, what is like immediately clear is the fact that there is an animal nature associated with this kind of food, with this kind of words that describe food. Okay, it is extremely evident, and in a way, this also represents the unmarked case, at least in the global north. If you, for me, I mean, I've been born and raised in Italy. If someone asks me about milk, it's just cow milk. It's not. I mean, yes, there can be other types of milk, but the thing that you go and buy in the supermarket is cow milk. So immediately it pops to your hand like, oh, milk, that's it. It's only this one. So this is the, if you want, the natural ideology in which you associate, oh, this is the word and this is what it triggers in my mind. I mean, milk is really animal based. So just to make an extra example. But what is happening is that there are alternatives, right? If you go to the market, in any supermarket, but also one of my favorite examples for this, if you step into a bar and you ask for a cappuccino, 9 out of 10, someone asks you back, okay, how do you want your cappuccino? Do you want with dairy milk, or do you want it with soy milk, milk, whatever? But people don't give it anymore for granted that milk is only one type of milk. So what is happening is that we are facing what is the plant-based alternatives, which currently are still considered to be the marked case. So the unnatural, from an ideological perspective, the unnatural ones, they start to be competitive with the unmarked ones. Competitive is not just in the market, but is mostly in the grammar. And this brings us to the first research question that I want to go together, which is, it concerns the renegotiation of part of the grammar of food, and especially the grammar related to meat, or the grammar related to protein consumption. Okay, and the question that I want to show you the next couple of minutes is, okay, is this markedness status of some of the foods, is it actually shifting? Is it shifted for real? So does the word milk is actually changing meaning or not? Do the word meat is changing meaning or not? This is the perspective to look at this problem. Okay, how can we answer these questions? So, well, this is a work that I conducted in collaboration with other colleagues here in Groningen. Our first go solution was, okay, we need to collect some corpus data. We need to go and see how people speak. And for this, we have focused on Reddit. We collected data from Reddit because we aimed at identifying the most ecological situations where people can actually freely speak about food and their preferences. Okay, we selected messages in English because it was just easier to collect lots of data. We have identified 2 broad time periods covering basically 12 years, from 2010 to 2022. And we have investigated this change from a diachronic perspective, so a long time, but also within communities. And to identify the communities, what we have done, we have looked for specific subreddits that can be used as proxies for communities. And we have then aggregated them into 2 broad categories. One is the sustainable community, which basically express users that are sensitive or knowledgeable of the alternatives and actually consume these plant-based alternatives. And then we have the generic public. And this is the community, let's say, of everybody else, okay? The layman person, ideally. Now, this selection of the messages to work on was guided by how we looked for food keywords coming from multiple policy documents at the European level and US levels, because this is an ongoing debate also in politics. Okay. In these slides, you can see that basically we have managed to collect a pretty big corpus. So we are speaking of more than 500,000 millions of words. So it's really big in terms of tokens. And what we have start looking once we have this data, what do we need to look for? So we focus on anchoring. Why anchoring? Because this is a way in which neologisms are actually happening. And if something happens with anchoring, 9 out of 10, what happens is that the meaning expands. A word meaning expands. So it becomes more and more ambiguous. And so it requires speakers to find ways to disambiguate. We need to be sure that when I say milk, we both understand what kind of milk I'm referring to, okay? Now, one of the strategies to disambiguate words that are actually coming into existence through anchoring is to use modifiers, which in English then basically becomes either you have a modifier noun construction or noun construction. Basically, this is what we were starting looking for. And what is interesting is that this basic construction, so with this combination of two tokens, if you want, they are really special because they can be classified from a linguistic perspective into neonyms, retronyms, and protonyms. Now, the protonyms that you see here in this picture is the original concept, milk. So when it was unmarked and everybody was understanding what was referring to, just to make this example. Whatever comes after through the anchoring process, what we see is that we start facing new words, and some of them are called neonyms, and some of them are called retronyms. Now, the retronyms is the set of words that retroactively identifies the older, once unique version concept. A retronym is dairy milk, because it helps to identify, to go back to the old protonyms. There was milk, there was animal based. Okay, so dairy milk is an instance of a retronym, while oat milk or soy milk, they're all instances of what is called neonyms, which is the new version of the concept. Okay, so what we're starting looking for was neonyms and retronyms with respect to our keywords. And as a proxy for identifying candidate terms that may have actually undergone a semantic change, we use frequency increase across time. Is it really happening or not? And for the initial keywords, we only retain those whose frequency increased in use. So milk, what we see is that there was a frequency increase from T0, our T0 with respect to T1. There was more than 2 standard deviations above the mean. Okay, so for each of the 21 keywords, we started looking into this frequency increase across time. And then from the identification of, for the identification of candidate retronyms and neonyms, what we did was, okay, these words are actually increased, so they're likely to have undergone a change, a semantic change, so a change in use. Let's start looking at all the bigrams that they are composing. Okay, and then let's transform these bigrams into collocations by using PMI. So basically, we set an empirical threshold for a PMI, and we said, okay, whatever is above this threshold, they are likely to be either retronyms or neonyms. It depends on the type of modifiers that accompanies them. Now, from the 21 original keywords, we ended up only with 4. This is and the original one, so milk, meat, cheese, and burger. And what you see in the slides, this is a list of candidate neonyms and retronyms that are actually combining together with this word. And if we start looking at the frequencies of these, the distribution of frequencies in time and also within the community of the neonyms and the retronyms that we have identified, candidate neonyms and retronyms that we have identified, what we observe for the sustainable community is that there is a steady increase of the use of the neonyms. The frequency jumps from 15 million words per million to 22 words per million. So it's a pretty big jump. And at the same time, we also see that the increase of the retronyms also increase. Actually, in this case, there is a double of increase. So from 5 words per million in T0, they jumped to 10 words per million. So it means that people are using more and more, even if they are in the, let's say, the innovators community, they are using more and more that needs to distinguish between the different type of food. But the most interesting for me is what happens in the generic community. In the generic community, what we see is that neonyms and retronyms are actually growing at the same pace for most of the time, and then this frequency gap becomes shorter, shorter, and shorter. And this means that there is an active debate in the generic community when it comes to food. So people are they feel the need to use more and more this differentiating between these kind of words. And this also indicates that there is a growing interest and awareness regarding alternative existing options. Now, if this is the case, what we see is that there is an increase in use of the retronyms and neonyms in both communities. So these two type of constructions are becoming more frequent in order to speak about specific type of foods. This clearly signals the fact that there are an increased level of awareness, but also the fact that some perspectives are changing. And if a protonym has actually undergone a semantic change, so this is what we want to start looking into. Is it also true that there is a perception of the unmarked? So the unmarked cases are actually shifting. So do these words are actually really undergoing a meaning change, especially for the protonym part? And when it comes for the understanding the protonym lexical semantic change, because that's exactly what we have done. So we focus on an experiment on subtle lexical semantic change, taking in consideration really short time period, because 12 years is really small if you think in terms of the phenomena that are involved when it comes to changing the meaning of a lexicon. So what we start looking is that, okay, following pragmatically oriented theory of meaning, a change in meaning is a change in use. So to measure change in use, what we start doing was comparing similarity between vectors. And I mean, comparing similarity between vectors is pretty powerful way of finding whether something is changing or not, but we have an issue when it comes to the evaluation. Why? Well, there is no threshold. No one is telling us that, oh, look, if the cosine score between two words coming from two different distributions is higher than 0.5, then you are also facing a semantic change. This is not true. So for every corpus and every experiment, you need to identify a good threshold. For us to assess whether protonyms is actually undergoing a meaning change, what we did was following previous work, and in particular, we followed the work by Huken and colleagues, where the comparison of the cosine distance, but also of any other type of comparison between different time periods is done by considering two random split of an initial corpus. As you can see on the left side of the slide or right side, it depends on how you look at the screen. So basically you start by, let's say, T0, and then you split this into two random half, and then you can compare what is the cosine similarity of your target word within the two random halves. And then you move to compare the cosine similarity of your target words between the entire T0 and the most recent corpus, T1. And if you see that there has been an increase, so basically from the full T1 to T0, the cosine score is actually higher, the cosine similarity is actually higher, then you're actually, with respect to the random split of the same corpus, then you're facing, you can say, okay, I'm facing a likely case of lexical semantic change. So a positive semantic change is one where the cosine distance between the vector in the random split of the same corpus is smaller than the one between the two corpora. Now, we used four ways of methods to compute the semantic change. And we did this diachronically, so over time and across the two community. Two of these methods are based on static embeddings. The first two that you see here in the slide, PPMI, is basically we were using a static embedding way of building, so it's count-based approach. And then we use word2vec the SGNS implementation, which is predicting, but is still static embeddings. And then we used BERT. Now, for BERT, we didn't use the actual vector representation because they are known not to work really well when it comes to semantic change. What we did was to use the parametric knowledge of BERT. So what we did was to prompt BERT to predict a masked keyword. And in this case, the masked keyword is one of the 4 protonyms that we were looking for. So given the entire sentence, we were masking every occurrence of milk, and we wanted to see, okay, what's the prediction that BERT gives me as an alternative to milk in this context? And this is the first approach that we used, so masking the keyword. But then what we did was also masking the pre-modifier of our keyword. So any word that was coming before our keyword, and see what was generated by the model. Okay. Now, the evaluation of BERT is not done using cosine score, but it's done looking at the overlap. But the approach behind this evaluation is exactly the same. So it's the overlap between 2 random split of the same corpus, and then the overlap across the 2 corpora. Okay. And a high overlap, it means that there is basically the word has not changed meaning. Okay, that's the point. Okay, let's look at the result. This is the first block of results, and it focuses just on the diachronic changes. Now here, accuracy refers to how often the distance between the keywords from different corpora is greater than the distance from the control corpus. We also computed the Pearson correlations between distance scores and gold labels, which is either 0 and 1 in our case. The point of the correlation is that if we have high correlation score, then it's easier to tell apart the keywords from the different corpora compared to with respect to the control corpus. Now, the model here shows pretty much a mixed performance. There are some signs of changing perception, so sign on some changes in the use of the words. Yes, this milk is changing the use. They are more stronger for the plant-based association with meat and milk in the sustainable community. In particular, they are emerging. This is what we are seeing. And the evidence, however, is still limited and it's really, really subtle. You can see that for the statistics, for the embedding approach, the Pearson score is really low, while for BERT we get better results. But in any case, the evidence is still limited and subtle, especially for the generic community. So we see a change in the sustainable community over time, but in the generic community, this change is less strong. That's so far. When a completely different story comes out, when we move to the diastratic, or when we start comparing the communities. All the models in this case perform much better. We get better results, also in terms of Pearson correlation. So it's really easy to distinguish between the use of the word milk when it comes from the sustainable community or when it comes from the generic community. What is interesting here is that the BERT keyword substitution actually reveals subtle but consistent differences in how, for instance, milk or any other word is actually perceived. There are more and more plant-based substitution in the sustainable group, while the generic tends to have sort of random changes, so nothing, so things that change out of the blue, or more neutral, so they remain on sort of animal-based milk. So to move towards the end of this first part and try to answer the markedness questions, is the markedness actually shifting? Well, there is a significant increase in the use of retronyms and neonyms. So this means that something is changing in the way the grammar of food is actually organized and it works. And this change is actually stronger amongst the early adopters. So sustainable people that belong to, let's say, our proxy for sustainable community, they do really have a different way in which they speak about food. Some food-related words, so this is our answer. Is the unmarked actually shifting? Well, some food-related words are changing meaning. Milk is one that is actually more forced in this meaning change. Meat a bit less, but milk is really strong. And this is more evident that there is a change in meaning across the community rather than across time, okay? And the marked distances, all of the marked distances that we've seen at the beginning, so everything with respect to milk, cheese, meat, and burger, it's really losing their mark status. So it means that we are negotiating more and more a disambiguation of the meaning, because when someone asks for a burger, is also the same questions like, how do you, it's not just how do you want your burger, what type of burger do you want? Do you want a vegan burger? Do you want a, and a vegan burger is a really new word if you think about that. It's just like a pretty unexpected unexpected thing. But this is what happens when it comes to food. Okay, so food is actually undergoing a change, and we are renegotiating this change. And what we did was to use corpus linguistics methods, and also some of the standard approaches in natural language processing, in order to see whether we're able to capture this renegotiation. And this renegotiation is a renegotiation of not only of meaning, but also of perspective, of how we construe reality, of how language is used to make the world that we live in. Okay, now shifting to the second part and towards the conclusion, let's try to look at something different. So I told you, like, okay, so let's first lexicon, then let's move to the to framing. So let's move to more different ways in which ideology can be expressed. And here I mean, in an earlier work, we look at how ideologies are expressed at the syntax semantic level interface. And what we did, we studied socially relevant events that involves what? Different power dynamics between the participants in this event. Car crashes is one instance of this type of event. Another one where the power dynamics is even more stronger, the difference in power dynamics is even more stronger, is are femicides, the killing of women on the account of their gender by men. So it entails even more bigger power dynamics within the, and also it is a big, really big socially relevant event. And what we did, we were focusing on how these events are actually narrated. Okay, and most interestingly, whether we could model computationally the perception of these narratives by the reader on the basis of what? On the basis of the frames, on the basis of the syntax and semantics that is actually used in the sentence. Long story short, yes, we managed to do, we can predict how people perceive when it comes to these socially relevant events. And just to give you an example, this is a picture that we got from this paper, which we call the Dead and Murder paper, is just the beginning of the title. But if you look at this picture, and just to make my point, this picture can actually be described either as a cyclist that slams into a car door, or a car driver that opens the door and hits the cyclist. Each description embodies a perception and triggers different perception in the readers in terms of who is responsible for doing something. Okay, now for today, luckily, we are in a completely more cheerful topic, which is environmental. I mean, cheerful from a certain perspective. So environmental sustainability. Let's remain on that. But let's focus on some frames with respect to environmental sustainability. So here, frames actually have a much, in general, frames have a much bigger role when it comes to the creation of neologism, and most importantly, of steering perception of the world. Okay, they're really heavy on these in terms of cognitive power that they have. Now, sustainable transition to mitigate climate change are urgently needed, and most of the people agree on this. Okay, even if voting behavior is different, but if you look at polls, people are worried about the future in terms of sustainability of the future. And there is also a strong scientific agreement on the fact that climate change is real. I mean, 99.9% of scientists agrees on climate change is real and is caused by humans. Okay, but scientists don't really drive and have a bigger impact in our lives, in our society. Politicians do much more. I'm not saying that they only them, but they have a bigger role in framing and setting the agenda of what we do things. So strong scientific agreement. What happens in politics when it comes to what? Okay, to in general environmental sustainability. How do we speak about environmental sustainability? Now, 3 research questions will drive us through this second part of the talk, and trust me, I will finish on time. It seems a lot, but it's not. Trust it. So first of all, is like, okay, how do politicians frame this debate on sustainability? What do we see? And then the second and the third questions are more funnier from from an NLP perspective. They're definitely funnier. Why? Well, how good can we use LLMs to rewrite claims and change political ideologies? Can I shift from left to right and right to left? How good is an LLM at do that? But what we also do was, okay, what if we constrain the LLM generation? Because telling the LLM rewrite this from a specific perspective, okay, we can actually rely a lot on parametric knowledge. We really don't know on the training set of these models, but okay, whatever. But what if we tell the model, okay, now you rewrite and you need to use this specific frame. So you need to frame the rewriting using this, not just the way you like it. Okay, which is really try to constrain the model to do something in a more specific way. Okay, so what have we done? What have we used? So the data in this case comes from a completely different resource, language resource, which is the Parlament corpus, and especially version 4 of the Parlament corpus. What is Parlament? It's a corpus of transcribed parliamentary speeches. It covers 26 countries in the European Union and 29 languages. Spain, for instance, has 4 official parliamentary languages. So it's a lot, okay? Parliament officially covers 8 years, from 2015 to 2022. We selected 6 because for 2015 and 16, we didn't really have much the data for all the parliaments. So the languages, sorry. So we said, okay, we cut from 2017 to 2022. So we covered, that's the time period that we took into consideration. And when it comes to environmental sustainability, it can be a lot in terms of, okay, what are you looking for? Because we don't speak about environmental sustainability. Environmental sustainability is composed by lots of subtopics. What we've done is restricting these to 2 big subtopics. One was climate change and the other was carbon emission, okay? And what we did was to retrieve relevant speeches, relevant transcriptions in all the different languages by looking for specific keywords. And we were looking for, we have identified 27 keywords that trigger a potential debate on climate change and 18 for carbon emissions. Keywords have been defined in language 1 and then translated all over the other 28, okay? Frames, again here, so frames is again Fillmorian frames. So just to make it clear that we are not doing journalism frames. So Fillmorian frame once again. And in order to identify the frame, what we have done is using a semantic parser, especially we use the LOM parser, which is based on an encoder-based model. So it's not generative, but it's really nice for classification. And LOM has been trained on is a multilingual, so that's the other important things, and it's based on FrameNet. So frames are really coming from the FrameNet, English FrameNet, and then you can run all on all the other languages. So this was how we processed all the transcribed speeches that were actually corresponding to our keywords. Once the frame have been identified, we selected for each possible subset of the data. This is important. So we have identified our data has been divided into from a time period perspective, so per year, by political party, per country. So once we have identified each possible subset of the data, what we have done is looking for typical frames. And the typical frames is what you use, and what is the frame that is more prototypically used for speaking about a certain topic, for speaking about a certain event. We measure these by using the proposal that is described in Foster and colleagues 2020. So we use what is the frame frequency times inverse collections frequency. It is clearly inspired by TF-IDF, but it doesn't use term, it uses frames, it doesn't use corpus, it uses a larger notions of data set, okay? So we use this FF-ICF measure to identify the typical frames. And what you see in these slides, so these are the first results. This goes like, okay, first research questions, we can start answering that. This is an overview of what the 10 most typical frame per topic, and you can see the numbers that you see on next to them is the score that we get from the FFICF. Sorry, I was just getting lost on the acronym. Okay, this is the score. So basically, is how strong is this frame with respect to this topic? How prototypical is this frame with respect to this topic? Now, not surprisingly, the first frames for each topic, they're really close to the topic themselves. I mean, climate change trigger undergo change. Well, not surprised. Carbon emission trigger emitting. Yeah, no surprise. Again, it's just in the name of the problem. So these two are not the most interesting things, but over time, if you start looking over time, we see two key trends. The focus of the topics is actually growing from 2017 to 2022. So it means that the frames are actually getting more and more stronger in terms of typicality. There is the highest FF-ICF score that we can see. So it's growing, and then we have a drop on 2019. It grows again. So basically interest in climate change and carbon surge again during the COVID-19. And it makes sense because somehow, if you remember, everybody was saying, yes, now there is COVID, but how about this other climate emergency that is actually just around the corner? So we should not forget about that. I mean, and they have just reignited attention on these issues. For climate change, what is interesting to observe is that causation and catastrophe are increasing over time. They start pretty weak, but they are becoming more predominant. So this also indicates that there is an increase in the awareness of the negative impact of the ongoing climate change fueled events, but also that something is behind climate change. So climate change is not happening because climate has always changed, but there is a cause behind that. When it comes to the frames, if we start looking across the political spectrum, what we observe is that for climate change, the undergo change is universally dominant, and catastrophe is prominent only on the political left. And for the carbon emission, it appears that there is a more ideologically neutral and mostly focused on the emitting and manufacturing. So manufacturing here suggests that there must be some, so we need to develop new artifacts that reduce or substitute carbon emissions. In general, causation rarely appears across the ideological parties. What is interesting is that it looks like that from political perspectives, the focus is more on both topics is mostly on what is actually happening rather than why do we see something. So this is how politician basically speaks about environmental sustainability. So across time, what we see is that there is an increase of the FF-ICF scores for all the frames. Also, and most importantly, for those expressing causation. So we start getting aware of some problems, but across ideologies, what happens is that the left has the stronger FF-ICF score, so they use more likely specific frames, and the center and the right have lower scores and tends to prioritize more neutral frames. So frames that just simply describes what is actually happening. Okay, this is the way politicians speaks about the framing of climate change and carbon emissions across Europe. What happens if we start moving forward and towards the end of the talk? Whether LLM. So the question is, can LLM perform ideological transfer, and whether we can constrain the transfer to use typical frames on a political ideology? We have framed the task. This is a task that we have framed as a multi-attribute style transfer, and we want to transfer style between ideologies and between ideologies using a specific frame. We tested 3 LLMs, all open weight, with parameter size between 7 and 8 billion parameters, just to stress test them in zero-shot and few-shot learning. Now, before showing the results, we have an issue here. Because for the few-shot settings, we would need some parallel examples, and they don't exist. But this is a data set that do not have this kind of data. So we developed an alignment measure that we have, the acronym is LBL, which is based on what? Is a linear combination of Bert score similarity and Levenstein distance. The higher, the more likely two claims, two sentences are actually speaking about the same topic. But we use different frames. That's what we wanted to keep into account. I'm skipping these slides for reason of time, but this is just to show you like, okay, we can actually align things. And if we take higher LBL scores, aligned sentences, it's likely that they are actually really speaking about the same. is a sort of a semi-parallel corpus that we have managed to create. And when it comes to the evaluation part, what we start looking for is, okay, we need to evaluate the ideology transfer. So to do this, we we developed a classifier that is able to detect whether a specific claim comes from the left, the right, or the center. We had a reliability threshold that higher than 0.7 F1 score. And this was actually sort of disappointing because only 4 languages were actually able to pass this threshold. So we then transfer all the rest on only 4 languages. I'm going to show English is one of them, not surprisingly. And then we evaluated with the frame transfer. How good is we are evaluating the frame transfer? Yes, what we did basically was random again on the newly generated sentences by the LLM and check whether the frame that we were looking for is actually present or not. These are the results. It's a big table. Let's try to break them down. So M stands for Mistral, L stands for Llama 3, and Q stands for Qwen 2.5. So these are the 3 LLMs that we have used. The few shot settings in general, when we start giving examples, both for ideology transfer, frame accuracy, and across the 2 topics, the few shot settings is actually working and much better. It improves the performances for the political ideology, but it does not really work for transfer frames. So, and this is likely due to a mismatch in the stylistic quality or the relevance of the examples that we have selected. Llama leads in political ideology transfer accuracy, especially in the 5-shot settings, while for frame semantics transfer, what we see is that results are mixed. They're basically all over the places, and no model consistently outperforms the others. Coming to the semantic transfer evaluation, another thing that we wanted to take into account is that we need to preserve the similarity, so the semantic preservation. So we need to have pretty big, high BERT similarity score, but we want also to have sort of low Rouge score, and again, high LBL score. So this is how we evaluated this part. And then we also look at the fluency. And for fluency, we proxy fluency using the perplexity. And we calculated perplexity using the MGPT, which is a multilingual model. Okay. The semantic preservation, what we see is that the 5-shot, again, yields better semantic preservation and fluency because we have low Rouge and high LBL scores without significant drop in BERT similarity. So providing more example helps the model to perform a rewriting task more effectively and from a different stylistic perspective. And when it comes to perplexity, so the fluency, it improves also with 5-shot. And in particular, it works for countries like Great Britain and Denmark, but it remains high for Galician, so Spanish Galician, ESGA. And this is due to the sentence segmentation errors and also limited language support for Galicians, both in the tool that we use to identify sentences, which was SPACY, but also in MGPT. To conclude, what are the lessons learned? So over time and across the political spectrum, the debate is slowly moving from the what to the why of sustainability, environmental sustainability. The framing transfer is challenging, but few shot settings is actually promising. And then support for low resource languages, I mean, Galician was our example, but any other support, low resource language is needed for LLMs to properly work with them. So, I mean, higher perplexity was just due for lack of data. Now, this brings me to the conclusions. These are all the people that have been working on for these 2 works. So Greta, one of my PhD students, and Saskia, Jan Willem, Harry, and then Oki, Elisa, Valeria, and Christina. These are some references, and I'll be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Tommaso. Thanks for the insightful talk. It was really like a lot of new things we got to know. If anyone have any questions, they can put their questions in the chat, then we can ask. In the meantime, I had just some generic questions. So the first thing I was curious about is this frame transfer that you talked about, like over the time, how the frames have changed. I was just curious. So like there has been work in NLP on kind of predicting this, how the meaning of words have changed over time. So there is a literature. So do you think like those kind of all those different approaches can be similarly applied on this frame thing, because these frames are what are
Hmm.
different, but it is kind of the similar things are happening where like over the time it is changing. Like in yeah, so yeah, what do you think? Like those kind of methods can be applied here? In,
I think so. It will be interesting to look. I think that it will become interesting to see whether over time a specific frame has actually also changed in terms of has expanded meaning. Because so what we have done here was really like looking at the frequency.
yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
so
yeah,
let's see how people use.
yeah,
But this
yeah.
will be really interesting to see whether there is a sort of a concept drift or concept change associated with frames. Yeah, we didn't look at, but yeah, nice idea. Yeah.
And another thing that I was thinking is that what I understood from this work is like, yeah, you took this frames and then you check that whether like with the frequency and all, you check the properties or how that have changed. So do you think that LLMs or any other methodologies, there is any scope where we can predict, you can predict from the previous corpus that like potentially this frame is going to change without looking at the future data? Because I'm thinking in terms of that, like because maybe that can be useful later to understand
Yeah.
that these are the things that can change. So do you think like there may be this existing data you can give the model with the parallel data that okay, so previously these words have changed, this is the corpus, but yeah, is there any
Mm.
scope, do you think that
No, I don't think. I think that for sure. Maybe the more a word is frequent, the more likely it can undergo a semantic change. This is a general thing, but semantic change, all of these kind of changes that we have discussed, I've presented so far, they are all happening at the semantic level, where there is a lot of arbitrariness in the way the change happens. I mean, there are even studies that have tried to predict whether a word, a neologism, was actually could be adopted or not. They didn't manage in the end because there are so many variables. I mean, the paper, they managed to do a lot of things, but there are so many things that we are not taking into consideration that is really like related to some of the more social dimension of context that they need to be there. The only thing that I know is that frequency could be a sort of, I mean, not a red flag, but the sort of things that you want to pay attention to and say, okay, this is a highly frequent word, is a highly polysemous word, maybe it's likely to undergo a semantic change.
mm, okay, okay. Yeah. And one other thing is that now that like we know that as like for example from your work we know that these frames, these words that have changed. So I think like my question is that like so the LLMs has been trained on a lot of corpus, right? So something from the recent, maybe something from the past. So what do you think like the recent LLMs? So they the pre-trained LLMs. So they
Mhm.
generally always tend to capture the most recent meaning, like or they behave differently, maybe in different contexts. Sometimes they behave like the old times, the way they generate the tokens or something, or like is it always the case that they
Hmm.
always like use that the tokens in the same context which has been used very recently, not the like
Yeah.
long ago? That's the kind of question that I'm trying to.
Yeah. No, I think so. Considering the nature, so the fact that they are contextualized, right? So these are all contextualized representation. An answer, a sort of a potential answer to your question is like, well, they should be able to change. They should not always use the most recent meaning, but should be able to offer a variation in the representation of the meanings. These, I think, should be tested.
Okay.
These should be tested and see to what extent it actually is
Mm,
there or not. Yeah.
okay. Okay. I
There is
think
a question.
yeah. Question. So this Rabindranath Nandi is asking, could you suggest some future research for low resource language in this direction? I think.
Huh. Future is, well, it depends. I mean, it depends. I think that one thing that becomes really interesting my perspective is to say, okay, what can you, how to enhance with low resource. You have low resource and on many levels. How can you enhance the performance of a tool like LOM or any semantic parser? How can this actually be done? And most interestingly is whether, and this is known that is not working, but how do you create new frames? How do we identify frames that are specific to a language that are not directly existing into another language? Because these differences are there, they exist. I mean, the English FrameNet is great, but you cannot take it and use it as is for all the languages of the world. You need to introduce other frames that are language specific. So I think that an interesting direction is to say, okay, can I use LLM in order to enhance this kind of things? Can I give rise to a sort of really virtuous human in the loop approach where the LLM starts suggesting and human corrects, so that basically you can generate a resource for a low resource language with few, yeah, in a limited effort, with limited effort. So that's something that I'll be interested in explore.
Okay. Yeah, I think we have another question, which is you mentioned only four languages passed the reliability threshold for ideology classification. So, is this mostly due to the lack of training data in those languages or poor generalization of the LLM? So, that's the kind of
Look,
question.
this is I'm happy that someone has these questions. So I have these extra slide because I was thinking, so maybe someone can ask this. These
Mm.
are the set of experiments that we've run, all of them. And what you see at the beginning, we have used multilingual data and monolingual settings, so and models and whatever.